Good evening. I'm David Day, and you're watching Asia in Review. And with me this evening is the president of Pacific Forum, Mr. Ralph Cossa. Ralph, it's really nice to have you here this evening, and
thank you, David.
We appreciate you taking the time. And we've got, folks, we've got a fascinating program for you this evening, and it's going to be all about Burma or Myanmar, depending on which name that you prefer, and some unusual events or connections that Hawaii's Pacific Forum has with Myanmar, or has had. And just to get the folks on board with this a little bit, Ralph, just a real short statement for those who don't know out there. What is Pacific Forum CSIS all about?
Well, Pacific Forum CSIS is a foreign policy think tank. It was established as Pacific Forum in 1975 by Admiral Joe Vasey, who believed that Asia was important and that the U.S. needed to raise its profile and be appreciative of the importance of Asia, and that Asians need to be reassured that the U.S. was remaining engaged. This was right at the end of the Vietnam War, you may recall. And we've been sort of doing that ever since, trying to remind Americans why Asia matters and remind Asians that America still cares.
So that actually Pacific Forum has been heavily engaged in Asia way long before the recent pivot occurred.
Oh, yeah. We pivoted many years ago. And our parent organization, CSIS, which was just rated the #1 in the world foreign policy security think tank, also pivoted toward Asia when they incorporated Pacific Forum back in 1989. So we've been very proud of that association and the focus that we bring to the Asia Pacific for CSIS and for Hawaii.
So folks, the title of this program is Myanmar. Is this a change we can believe in? And we'll get into the reforms and developments in Myanmar a little bit further down in the program. But initially what we want to talk about is Mr. Cossa's connection with Myanmar, and in particular, I'm interested to learn more about Ralph, your personal contact and meeting with the democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi. And when did this occur?
I met her in 2002, David, when she was out from under house arrest. There was a short period of time in 2002 where she had been released from house arrest, and she was told that there were no restrictions put on her. You may recall that ultimately she traveled into the countryside. That created quite a fuss, and as a result of that, they put her back under house arrest. But before that happened, she approached the American Center in Rangoon and asked them if they could find an American speaker who would come in and be the first foreigner to give a lecture at National League for Democracy headquarters, just to see if the government would allow it or whether they'd break it up. The person in charge there was a good friend of mine, and he called me, and I jumped at the chance to do it.
Oh, wait a minute now. Let's see if I understand this. You were effectively invited to be the test guinea pig.
Well, more or less.
To see how the government would tolerate Aung San Suu Kyi's temporary period of freedom.
Yeah.
Basically.
Essentially. It was like, let's see if they're serious, or whether if they throw you in jail, then we know that they're not serious.
Let's get this guy Ralph Cossa in from Hawaii.
In jail for a while.
All right. Okay, good.
I assessed the odds of that happening where I hoped pretty low, and the opportunity to meet with Aung San Suu Kyi and be able to give the first lecture by a foreigner there in Rangoon was just too good a chance to pass up.
So you traveled to Burma, to Myanmar. Right. By the way, what should I do with this? Is it Burma or is it Myanmar?
Well, it depends. If you want to keep Americans happy and you want to stay on the right side of the State Department, you say Burma. Today at least.
Okay. Today.
If you want to keep Aung San Suu Kyi happy, you say Burma, because she refuses to change the name. Now, once she gets elected, presumably to the parliament, she may decide that she lives in Myanmar rather than Burma, and then we can change. The Southeast Asians call it Myanmar. That's what the country is called. Of course, it's a lot easier to say Burmese than Myanmarese. So for that, just for that reason alone, why don't we stick with Burma?
Okay, we'll stick with Burma
for this interview.
All right. So here we are, we're back, it's 10 years ago roughly, 2002, and you're going to visit the National League for Democracy headquarters in then called Rangoon.
Right.
And so what was this place like?
Well, it was like a big garage, actually. It was just a big sort of open building with bright red painted walls and very open. Must have been 1,000 people crammed into it, and more people outside with loudspeakers going outside. And then upstairs there was a private office, which was Aung San Suu Kyi's office, or the headquarters for National League for Democracy. But the building itself was just sort of like a big garage with no automobiles in it, and a vacant, empty garage.
So we'll get into your talk in a moment, but basically your voice is broadcast out into the streets, where presumably representatives of the then military junta could see how you were sounding.
I mean, we assumed that within the crowd there were probably a dozen or so, maybe more, who knows, members of the state security, in part, to listen to what I had to say, in part to see who else was there, and to, sort of keep track of who was on their list.
Keeping a list, yeah.
Yeah, dissidents they wanted to throw in jail at some point.
Okay.
So, we assumed that, in the crowd there were some nasty people, but hopefully they'd pay attention too.
Okay, and so what role did Aung San Suu Kyi play in this talk that you gave?
This was, to me, was the amazing part, and why it was such a treat. Aung San Suu Kyi is surrounded by two types of people. There are some very bright, very educated, Harvard-educated, former lawyers, former ambassadors, all of whom were in their 70s and 80s or older. And then this massive throng of very enthusiastic young people who were, not well educated, some cases illiterate, certainly not fluent in English. So when I was asked to speak, I had to have an interpreter.
Okay.
And that interpreter happened to be Aung San Suu Kyi.
No kidding.
So it was like, how often do you have a Nobel Peace Prize winner acting as your interpreter? Again,
all right.
Too good a deal to show up. But the amazing thing was that I arrived and I was met by one of these old ambassadors, a wonderful man. I can't think of his name now. But he sort of ushered me in, and we went into the room where the speech was going to be, into this big open area, and there was just tons of people, masses of people, and all of a sudden,
hot and humid in there.
Hot, humid, no air
okay.
conditioning, massive humanity, and very noisy, of course, that everyone's sort of chattering back and forth, and all of a sudden, sort of a hush fell over the crowd, and then the crowd sort of parted. Just like a Hollywood movie,
oh my God.
I swear to God.
Really?
And in walked Aung San Suu Kyi, just like you would have imagined, with the little plumeria flower in her hair, just sort of walking in, and I mean, you could almost see the aura around her, and this sounds so corny, and I'm not a sentimentalist, but you felt like you were in the presence of greatness. I mean, I've met Nobel Prize winners before. They're all, wonderful people and all, but the sense that you got, the way the people just sort of crowded around her, and this hush that came over the room, and the waves, the masses parting as she walked in, and there's just this very simple, fragile, lady with the flower in her hair, but it was just so obvious the respect that she garnered and had earned, obviously. So it was a remarkable experience. I'll never forget that moment as the crowd parted and in she walked.
There may be a bankruptcy involved, but that was what we would call, as Americans, one heck of a Kodak moment, right? Wow. Okay,
yeah.
So she's serving as your interpreter, and what's the speech, the litmus test speech for freedom in Southeast Asia that you gave? What did you talk about?
Yeah, I was, I can hardly even remember now what I talked about, to be honest with you. But it was supposed to be talking about American foreign policy in East Asia, and we opened it up for Q&A as well. And she asked a number of questions. She had her own, sort of pointed view. In fact, the questions quickly got around to Pakistan,
really?
Which I was not particularly well versed in.
Okay, but for our viewers, now remember, this is basically a few months after 9/11. A year after.
Yeah, a year after.
A year after 9/11. Okay, so Pakistan. All right.
But I didn't sort of catch it at the time, and then as we started talking, it became very obvious the reason she wanted to talk about Pakistan was that the U.S. had essentially entered into a marriage of convenience with General Musharraf. And what she was trying to lead me into explaining was the difference between why the U.S. might do that with Musharraf, but that wasn't a good policy to do toward the military junta in Burma.
General Tan Sui and company.
And that whole group. And obviously, there were some significant differences between Tan Sui and Musharraf, not the least of which was that we needed Musharraf and needed to, cooperate with him, given Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden and the whole 9 yards. But it was very interesting that she was very concerned. I mean, one of the points that she wanted to draw out and wanted to discuss was this sort of American support for dictators, which, from her standpoint, ran against American principles. And if nothing else, she was a very high-principled person, also a person who, in my view at the time, was incredibly unyielding and inflexible when it came to any type of compromise or any type of interaction with the generals. She believed that she was in the right, they were in the wrong, and by God, she was going to, keep going down her path until they finally waved a white flag and surrendered. Which,
and that's of
course, they didn't.
They didn't, and she did stand her ground, and
she ended up back under house arrest for another 10 years or so, or 9 years.
And that, I'm just curious. So we'll get back to this presentation in the hot room with thousands of people. What was the reaction to the average Burmese that was there? Could you tell to the translation?
I mean, quite honestly, I'm sure that they were more interested in hearing her translate my words than they were in my words. This was just an opportunity to see Aung San Suu Kyi, and they all appreciated that. The crowd appeared very attentive. They were very polite. I did get a number of questions. Again, this was 10 years ago. I can barely remember what I said, much less the questions. But it was a good interaction, and they were obviously very concerned about U.S. foreign policy, about whether the U.S. would be lifting sanctions against Burma, which they were very strongly against any lifting of sanctions. And, that was sort of the general gist. At that point, ASEAN was just sort of starting to come of age in some areas, and they were curious as to the U.S.-ASEAN connection and where it might go and how Burma might or might not hold back what the U.S. was doing, which at the time, this was a real drag on U.S. cooperation with Burma, as it has been for decades until just most recently.
You're watching Asia in Review, our program, Myanmar. Is this a change we can believe in? And before we get into that change, we're talking with Mr. Ralph Cossa, who is the president of Pacific Forum, and his prior connections and relationship, if you will, with the democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi. So, Ralph, after this talk that you gave and the translation and the question and answer period, I think our viewers here would like to know kind of what happened next.
What happened next was we went upstairs, the American Center Director, Ron Post, and myself, along with Aung San Suu Kyi and a couple of her closest advisors, again, some of these former ambassadors. I think several of them had been Harvard graduates. And we just talked for about 4 hours. It just had just
4 hours.
Yeah, just a great conversation about where she thought Burma was going, where she felt it needed to be going, and we exchanged views. Quite frankly, we didn't agree on everything, but it was a good give and take, and I certainly came away with a very strong feeling about A, her power, B, her dedication. And C, it's hard to say this without sounding negative, but inflexibility. I mean,
okay.
she just didn't want to give an inch, and of course,
and we can see that she did not over the years.
That's right, and she didn't, and she felt that this was very important to take a principled stand. I mean, I recall talking a little bit about Nelson Mandela and how he had sort of made certain compromises and all of that, and her view
She was not hearing any of this.
That would not work in Burma. That would not work with Tan Shui and the generals, that they had to hold firm and that they wanted everyone else to hold firm.
Well, Ralph, your insight into her perspective and her mind is really important. You know, as we get into talking about where Burma is today and where it might go, and in this conversation, the first finger that you ticked off here was you became aware of her power. What do you mean by that?
Just the aura around her. I mean, it was very clear, and of course they had discovered this 10 or so years earlier when they had their election and the people came out in droves for the National League for Democracy. I mean, it was just very clear that she was not just an iconic figure in the West, but in Burma itself, and that people were prepared to follow her, and that she had a vision and a view of where to go. But I'll give you an example, David, of where we sort of disagreed, because it was very vivid in my mind. The day before I gave my lecture there, the American Center had set me up to do a roundtable with a group of young people. You know, we do this Pacific Forum Young Leaders Program.
Right, okay.
We were just in the process then of sort of trying to identify young people that we might, be able to bring to our different events.
So these would be young Burmese.
Young Burmese.
Okay.
There was a group of, I call 12 or 14, all of whom were going to do graduate studies in the United States. They were all on various, Fulbrights and different scholarships and all. So the best and the brightest. All of them essentially children of the elite in Burma. And I had this wonderful roundtable with them, and it was a good give and take. And these kids were very bright and asked a lot of hard questions. And I sort of came away from that very impressed and feeling somewhat positive about the future if these young kids could be playing a role in it. And it's part of why we do our broader Young Leaders Program, because we want to sort of groom this next generation.
Ralph, I need you to explain for the audience here. You used the word elite. Yeah. So these were sons and daughters of the wealthy,
of the generals,
of the
bureaucrats, of the the country's leaders.
So these would not be people out of
it wouldn't have been people. It wouldn't have been my son. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it was.
Right. But these are not National League for Democracy.
Oh no. All of these kids are the generals' kids and the parliamentarians' kids, and I mean these are kids from the elite, from the ruling establishment, and.
Okay, so they're over here, and Aung San Suu Kyi is over here.
Yeah, I mean not physically,
but I mean they're just
I mean they're a mile apart. And when she and I met, I told her that I was very impressed with these kids and thought that this was her cohort. This was the group that she needed to reach out to, because they were going to be like these old ambassadors around her. These were going to be the Western educated, smart people. And her view was they couldn't be trusted because they're the children of the elite. And that you really, and she had sort of a narrow view of those people who were protesters who were outside of Burma. There was this whole other group of expatriates, Burmese, who were also protesting. But from her view, it was sort of like, the people inside, the ones that were paying their dues, these were the ones that, should be moving forward. And I just felt, I said, trust me, children love to rebel against their parents. Smart kids.
We know that.
That's right. Yeah, I've learned that by personal experience. The sort of the pampered class goes to the United States. They see, what the real world looks like, and these are the people that are going to want to instigate change. And when they come back and talk about it, they're not going to be thrown in jail because their father won't let them get thrown in jail. Whereas, her supporters would be more quick to throw in jail. So from my standpoint, sort of maybe an oversimplistic view, these were people who you might want to sort of reach out to. But her feel at the time, at least, was we got to keep it within the group. That to me, I think demonstrated, and I've seen this in other countries. I saw this in Iraq a number of years ago. The sort of absolute paranoia that you get when you're in that kind of a closed society. I mean, I'm sure what was going on in her mind was, maybe 9 out of 10 of these kids would be really good and would march down the street with us, but that 10th one is probably going to turn us in and do something else, and you can't trust them. And I had some experience that I had led a delegation to Iraq years ago, just before they invaded Kuwait back in the early 90s. And I met with some professors who were just absolutely terrified to even talk with me or meet with me for fear that, something would happen to them later. So it's hard for Americans to really put themselves in the shoes and in the mindset of people that live in those kind of societies, because you say something stupid, I say something stupid here, I only embarrass myself. No one's going to throw me in jail for it. They might jail you for tolerating me.
That's right.
But I'm pretty safe on all of this stuff. So it's you don't want to judge them. You don't. That's why I say I hated to use the word inflexible, because this is an inflexibility that was earned. It was learned as a result of sort of reinforcing behavior and everything. But it's still it makes you doubly admire someone like Nelson Mandela, who was able to sort of make that compromise. So, fast forward 10 years, I think one of the remarkable things that's happened today in Burma is not just the reform efforts by the government, but also her decision to be more flexible and to essentially, if not meet them halfway, at least meet them part of the way before they've delivered. I mean, nobody believes that we have change you can believe in Burma yet. What people believe is that they're taking a first step, and now they have to sort of put their money where their mouth is. And the Aung San Suu Kyi of 10 years ago would have said, "Call me when you get there, and then we'll talk."
Okay.
I think some people will want to give Secretary Clinton for that credit for that, and she's certainly, quite a remarkable meeting. I mean, the picture of these two incredibly powerful women together was quite amazing. But her Assistant Secretary of State, Kurt Campbell, had gone to Burma several months earlier and met with Aung San Suu Kyi and sort of laid the ground. And I think he's probably the unsung hero in all of this. I haven't had a chance to talk with him since those trips, but I think he must have had some incredibly persuasive arguments. And obviously, her willingness to be more flexible, combined with the government's willingness to take some at least modest steps toward reform, have now resulted in the National League for Democracy becoming a legitimate party again, and her running in one of the by-elections. Presumably, I couldn't imagine her not winning.
Yeah, I can't either.
If she doesn't, then we got to really demand a recount, folks. So yeah, it's quite a remarkable turn of events.
So she would, following up on what you just said, Ralph. She will. The default position for her is that Aung San Suu Kyi will end up as a leader of a minority faction in their parliament under the new reforms, under the Thein Sein government, right?
Yes, and that's, I mean, even the fact that she's allowed to run is remarkable. They had essentially written a law in their constitution that prevented anyone who was married to a foreigner from running. Right. Gee, I wonder who that was aimed at. So again, there's been some flexibility. Obviously, she is going to be an extremely powerful force within the parliament and within the country, and at some point, if there are really free and fair elections, you obviously got to believe that that her party will prevail. Now, who knows when that may occur or whether that may occur, but at least we're seeing steps in the right direction.
Let's step out of this topic for a moment here, Ralph. I mean, one of the things that's often helpful for people is kind of the compare and contrast situation, and we'll come back to Myanmar and Burma in a few minutes here. But I'd like you to take a couple minutes and let's take this whole concept, the Pacific Forum Young Leaders Program, and the idea of bringing young people into the foreign policy decision-making and education process that Pacific Forum does. And I see you there with this group of the sons and daughters of the elite in Burma in 2002, and you know, I think quite naturally for you, as your position as president of Pacific Forum, you're saying to yourself, you're seeing possibilities of working with the future leaders of the country. And so let's shift from Myanmar now, and let's go just for a moment, if we could, to North Korea. All right, and so let's just imagine that you had the same opportunity in Pyongyang in 2012 that you had in 2002 in Myanmar, and you had a chance to meet with the sons and daughters of the elite, and then you had a cognac or a cup of coffee with the new young leader Kim Jong-un. I mean, is there something? Do you think we would see the same level of inflexibility from Kim Jong-un at this time that you saw in 2002 with Aung San Suu Kyi?
Well,
I don't want to compare the two.
Yeah, David. I mean, it's such a apples and oranges situation. I mean, Kim Jong-un is no Aung San Suu Kyi. He's no, we see reports now already coming out that he's going to be a reformer, quote unquote. You know, hang on to your hat. If there was an opposition leader in North Korea, that would be the parallel. But the mere fact that any opposition leader in North Korea is going to find themselves in the gulag or killed or worse, in reality, that would have probably happened to Aung San Suu Kyi as well if her father hadn't have been a national hero. So that was sort of what protected her, was her not just her international icon status, but her status within the country as the daughter of one of their founding fathers. So that sort of gave her the protection. There is no one like that in North Korea. The parallel might be Kim Jong-nam, who is the oldest brother of Kim Jong-un, who is not necessarily a reformer or democracy advocate. He's actually stays and loves to gamble in Macau, but he's certainly not back there. And he's made some comments about his brother couldn't possibly be in charge. He's too young and not bright enough, and this kind of thing. I think the reverse of that, though, is true. I think that one of the things that we've tried to do, we've invited the North Koreans, who we meet with quite regularly, to send young researchers and young professionals from their Institute for Disarmament and Peace to participate in our Young Leaders programs. And we've invited several of them to come. We're doing a meeting in Sydney in March, and we're kind of hoping but not expecting that we'll get a couple of young North Koreans there, as well as the seniors. And we'll keep trying that, because I think it's important to try to reach out to the younger generation. The other thing that we're doing, which we are having actually some success at, is identifying North Korean defectors who are now living in Korea or in the United States, in South Korea or in the United States. And we're getting them involved in our Young Leaders program as part of our Kelly Fellows program. And we'll be doing a meeting here in Maui in a couple of weeks looking at U.S.-Korea strategic relations. And we will have about a half a dozen or 8 or so young Koreans, South Koreans, who will be part of this process to listen to the senior dialogue. One of those South Koreans will have actually come from the North and had defected and come across. And I've had a couple of meetings now with these young kids. They're quite remarkable. They're very dedicated to sort of wanting to get ahead. They're all, interestingly enough, very religious. I think that there's some Christian organizations that sort of run the Underground Railroad, if you will, that gets you from Pyongyang through North Korea through China to some safe haven somewhere in Mongolia, Thailand, Vietnam, wherever they go, and then on to South Korea. And it seems that sort of they need an organized religion to sort of replace in their mind the organized religion of Kim Il-sungism, which is is quite fascinating. And we think we need to sort of be grooming these kids because they're the potential leaders. If in fact you get reunification, they can go back and talk with some type of credibility. So
Sure.
that's part of what we do at the Pacific Forum is try to
Now,
get the next generation.
In the Young Leaders Program at Pacific Forum, have you ever had young Burmese participate?
We have had one young Burmese who's been part of the program. She was studying in Japan at the time, and as part of our Young Leaders Network, we're still trying to find some additional ones. I mean, we've got young people from I think 30-some different countries now. So,
This young Burmese that has participated in the Pacific Forum program, would you consider her from the elite in Burma?
Oh yeah,
she was.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go back to Myanmar and our topic of discussion today. And would you, Ralph, just kind of lead me through the key reforms that you think are significant? You've talked about the ability of Aung San Suu Kyi to run due to a legal change, dropping that law that prohibited anyone that was married to a foreigner to run for election. What else has happened in Myanmar that's remarkable in your mind?
Well, I mean, they have, in theory, they've shifted from a military government to a civilian government now. And for the most part, what that meant was that the military took off their uniforms, put on their coat and tie, and ran. And oh, surprise, they happened to win. But it does at least sort of downplay somewhat the military control over the government. Now, there are still interest groups, and it's still not a completely democratically elected parliament, and there's still enough rules in place to prevent them from losing their majority. That's not uncommon in other Southeast Asian countries, some of which we loosely call democracies, but have, and it's, similar to what we've seen in the democratic experience in Hong Kong, where you still have these groups that sort of have influence. I mean, Secretary Clinton said it very well when she was interviewed by all of the news media when she arrived in Rangoon, and the immediate thing they were looking for was a headline, is that Burma has turned the corner, and her response was no. They've opened the door, now they've got to come out, then they got to sort of turn the corner. So all we've really seen thus far have been very modest steps, but they're the types of steps that are the essential first steps that they hadn't taken in the last 20 or 30 years. And I think it's the administration's view that you've got to sort of encourage that.
Why and why now?
I mean, I think a number of reasons. First of all, they understand that they are the pariahs of Southeast Asia and increasingly the pariahs of the world. When you get together and call a meeting at the Dictators Club now, there's not a lot of folks that show up, and there's fewer and fewer.
Right.
Fewer and fewer every year.
Down to two card tables instead of an auditorium.
You see what happened to Gaddafi, and you see what happened to Mubarak, and Mubarak was a saint compared to the leadership in Pyongyang or in Rangoon. And you've got to see some writing on the wall. Unfortunately, the North Koreans don't seem to be able to read that writing yet, but the Burmese have. Secondly, you had sort of the internal pressure that was coming from within the other countries of ASEAN. You may recall back in, I think it was 2006 or 2008, it was supposed to be Burma's turn to chair ASEAN. And essentially the rest of them put pressure on them to skip their turn, because it would have been an embarrassment to this organization to have had it being chaired by someone from Burma. That was a pretty heavy slap in the face. Yeah. Now they've just agreed that Burma will be able to chair ASEAN in 2014, assuming that they stay on track. So
2 years from now.
2 years from now.
So they've got
Cambodia this year, then Brunei, and then Burma will be the.
So they have to kind of clean up their act in 2
years.
So
if they don't sort of, first of all, the bar is much lower to keep ASEAN happy than to keep the United States happy.
I understand
that. But they've got to at least be sort of not backsliding and moving in the right direction. Obviously, if in the next 2 years Aung San Suu Kyi gets thrown back in jail or under house arrest, that's not going to bode very well for him. And then I think ASEAN members will sort of get together and there'll be another vote. But for right now, at least, they've read the writing on the wall. They're trying to move in the right direction. They're doing it in a very slow, cautious way because and they've watched, reforms going around all around them. I mean, we complain about China, but, the China that's there today is certainly not the China of Mao. I mean, there have been a lot of reforms in that area as well. You've seen the same thing in Malaysia. You've seen the same thing in Singapore. So the tide of history, being on the
right
wrong side of history,
I've heard that before.
has its toll. So I think they've discovered now. Are they channeling their inner Thomas Jefferson? I don't think so. I don't think that's what's driving them. But to survive, they need to loosen up and to sort of maintain any kind of respectability within the international community and within their own neighborhood, within ASEAN. They have to make an effort. So you've got to give a lot of credit to the other 9 countries in ASEAN, and particularly the core members. And then you've got to give a credit, I think, to the current administration and their efforts to do that. And oh, by the way, you've got to give a lot of credit, I think, to Senator Rice and those folks as well, because they sort of gave the political cover for the administration to Jim Webb. Gave the political cover to be able to do this kind of overture without being accused of selling the United States out. And of course, the candidates right now, the opposition candidates, would be having a field day with this, if not for the fact that you've got a picture of Hillary with Aung San Suu Kyi, because that's your impenetrable shield. And the fact that Obama picked up a phone, presumably, and called Aung San Suu Kyi before he made those announcements and before he moved in that favor, I mean, you've got to be a real Cro-Magnon to say, no, we still shouldn't have done this after Aung San Suu Kyi asked you to do it. So, it was a politically gutsy move, but one that was sort of protected as a result of having Aung San Suu Kyi. It will be much more difficult. We're seeing in the newspaper today about some overtures toward Iran, overtures toward North Korea. You don't have an Aung San Suu Kyi there to say,
it's okay,
this.
Come on in.
Yeah, come on in. So those will, I think, become much more politically contentious issues. But fortunately, I think this won't become a political issue in the U.S.
Ralph, this last year, we've seen this whole series of reforms take place virtually within the confines of 2011. And I'm hoping, as I know you are, that there are many more to come. In 2011, the chair of ASEAN was Indonesia.
Right.
And do you know whether Indonesia has been, as the big gorilla in Southeast Asia, have they been influential in pushing some of these reforms or providing some guidance, you think?
I mean, I have to believe that they have been. Of course, the Indonesians have become evangelists for democracy. They're sort of the new flourishing democracy on the bloc, and they've done much better than I think most people expected that they would. I mean, SBY has been a very effective leader. We'll see if the next round of leadership takes it in the right direction. But clearly, Indonesia has been at the forefront of promoting human rights within ASEAN, promoting democracy within ASEAN. And when the big kid speaks, the others have to listen. They can't dominate it by themselves. It's sort of the ASEAN way. They all have to agree or pretend to agree on something before they can move forward. But obviously, if you've got the big kid on the block against it, it ain't going to happen. And the big kid on the block is no longer against it. In fact, they're for it and being subtle. And if you've ever met Foreign Minister Marty from Indonesia, he's brilliant. He's the right guy at the right place at the right time. I mean, he's got a picture of geopolitics and Indonesia's view, not just within ASEAN, but its global position.
As a global player.
And Indonesia is a global player. And we're fortunate that we have a president of the United States who Indonesians can openly like without being criticized because he spent a couple of years in Indonesia as a kid. So that provides SBY with a certain amount of political cover that has allowed us to cooperate and has allowed them to pursue things, not because it's in our interest, but because they want to also, and our interests happen to coincide much more deeply than they did in the past.
Let's go back, Ralph, to the focus now on Burma or Myanmar. And the topic that I'd like to talk about next is the development of the country from a business perspective standpoint. And before we get into that, maybe could you, to the extent you're able to, can you kind of paint the picture of where Burma was as a British colony maybe at the end of World War II, something like that? I mean,
I'd be making it up, David, to be honest with you. I don't have that good a sense of history. I mean, I do know that this is a country that has been very rich in natural resources, that has essentially squandered a lot of that and has had a lot of that exploited. It's also a country right now where the whole banking system is corrupt and not very well developed. If today there are still strong sanctions against Burma, and we have not lifted those sanctions, so they're still in place. But if tomorrow morning, we wake up and the president or Secretary Clinton is on the phone saying, we are lifting all sanctions on Burma, I don't think you're going to see a massive rush to invest there because the rule of law still doesn't necessarily prevail. You still have very immature or inefficient banking systems, and so the whole idea of how do you go about investing, how do you go about ensuring that your money will be safe if you do invest there. I mean, if we lifted sanctions against North Korea at the same time, I'd put my money in Burma before North Korea because there are some places that are even worse. But clearly, this is still an area that has a long way to go. It has, its infrastructure has atrophied over time. Whatever the Brits left is long gone, and what you have now is a system that is suffered through years of dictatorship and
decay,
cronyism. So all of that has to be rebuilt. Now you've got to if you open up the door, then you allow the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank and others to come in and start rebuilding. That's the good news, but it's going to take a while before it's there. And I would, if I was investing money in Southeast Asia, I'd still put it in Vietnam and not in Burma, because the Vietnamese have got their act together at least.
Well, let's combine the topic now of business with maybe the geopolitical strategic importance of Burma and its location. We've got a country here that borders on Thailand on one side, and then it borders on China, and a little piece of it borders on India, and so it sits in a very unusual position to provide China with access to the Indian Ocean, and India with access into Southeast Asia, and Thailand over to India. And from a business standpoint, I mean, we've certainly over the last few years we've seen enormous, seems like Chinese investment in Burma, in Myanmar. My question to you is, what is the extent of the Chinese influence and presence in Burma, Myanmar today?
Well, David, it's a good question, but first I want to commend you. This is the first time I've had a conversation on talking about Burma that China didn't come up within the first 3 minutes. I mean, normally this is where people start the conversation. It's all about China, and the Chinese believe everything is all about China. And there is a Chinese dimension to it. The Chinese have invested heavily there. Chinese are investing heavily everywhere. And certainly if you're a country that is resource rich and politically poor, you're made for the Chinese because if no one else will deal with you.
Wait a second now. I
know,
mean,
the
you could be
Chinese
resource rich and politically rich like Australia, and the Chinese would still be heavily investing in you.
That's true, but so would everyone else.
That's okay.
I mean, the problem with Burma is not that the Chinese are investing, but that the Chinese are locking up the market. It's the same thing in North Korea. The South Koreans don't worry about China invading North Korea. They worry about China buying North Korea.
Okay.
Because there's no competition. In Australia, you don't worry about the Chinese buying Australia. They're going to buy a piece. We're going to buy a piece. Everyone gets a piece.
Everybody gets a piece. Okay.
And when you put your money there that it's safe.
Right.
You don't have that view in Burma. So China is the best friend of countries that have no friends.
Wait, say that again. China is the best friend
of countries that have no friends. Yeah, I like that. I'm going to have to
you
use
heard
that
here
myself.
first on Asian Review. This is Ralph Cossa, the president of Pacific Forum.
You heard that first.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that. Write that down, David. Yeah. But anyway, I mean, it's true. If you look at, remember this Tyrants Club we were talking about
the two card
previously,
tables.
it's dwindling down. But the one thing that all these guys have in common is that their best friend is China, and the Chinese are out protecting them in the international community and the sacred principle of non-interference in internal affairs, et cetera, et cetera. And the Chinese. Others may have to hold their nose and invest in Burma. The Chinese don't have to hold their nose; they just go on in and invest. So certainly, if you were Burmese, if you're a North Korean, you want to have options. You don't want to just be dependent on China. And I think the Burmese have figured out that they want to have some other options. For the last couple of years, they've been fortunate in that being able to play India against China, but it's nice to have more options than those two. So I think what you're now seeing is that they're sort of opening the door to others. That doesn't mean they're going to throw the Chinese out. The Chinese still are going to be a significant economic force and political force in Burma.
They got a very delicate dance that they have to undertake to maintain stability, don't they?
Yeah, I mean it's sort of funny, when you go to an ARF meeting or an ASEAN meeting. The countries of ASEAN will criticize the Burmese when they're all together. Then when they get into a forum with the Chinese are trying to pressure them not to criticize Burma. So it's sort of like, well, that's interfering in ASEAN's internal affairs. China, you're not supposed to interfere. But, they've never met a tyrant they didn't like or something. I don't know the other phrase. I'll quit while I'm ahead and not try to come up with any more clever sayings. But the Chinese clearly have an influence there, and I think the Burmese have an interest in balancing that by also maintaining good ties with the Indians, but also with their ASEAN neighbors, and also with the United States. And the U.S. isn't promoting democracy in Burma because China isn't.
Right.
The U.S. is promoting it because that's what we do. That's what we do everywhere. Sometimes we do it in an obnoxious way. Sometimes we're a little more subtle. But that's what Americans do. That's our ideological drive. So, if the Chinese didn't exist, if there wasn't a dime of Chinese investment in Burma, we would still be doing, I think, what we're trying to do. But it's fun when you play geopolitics to say, this is another part of the Chinese-Burmese, U.S. chess match, and, we're trying to counter the Chinese here. There are things that the Chinese can do, are doing, will continue to do in Burma that, don't affect us and don't have a negative impact. On the other hand, if the Chinese are shoring up a government that's flagrant in its human rights abuses, if, as some people suspect, that there are North Koreans around the corner trying to sell them
nuclear weapons,
this, that, and the other thing, I personally think it's a bit of a stretch. I would imagine that the Burmese seem to be extremely paranoid. The one thing the North Koreans know how to do is dig tunnels deep, and sort of their subway system, I'm told, is like 300 meters underground or something like that. It's
deepest in the world.
Clearly, an air raid shelter. So I would I would be more inclined to believe the North Koreans are in Burma teaching them how to dig tunnels and build shelters than how to build nuclear weapons. But you got to watch it. Obviously, you have to watch it, and you know, the Chinese are going to be less attuned to watching that than we might be, or that Burma's neighbors might be.
You know, this influence by China is something that we have all seen over the last few years. But I guess in this last fall, this dam construction project that was put on hold, at least as far as I'm concerned, was a huge surprise to me, because I found it hard to believe that the little client state like Burma would hold up its hands and say, no, wait a second here, we're not sure about this. What's your take on that?
You know, I think it was an important symbolic gesture that sort of, you know, told the Chinese you got to back off a little bit. It also, you know, as I understand this, and I don't know a lot of the details of this project, but I know I've been in a number of different Southeast Asian countries where there have been big Chinese projects. I was in Timor in last January, about this time last year. And, you know, there are a number of big, tall buildings, the Foreign Ministry building, there's another, you know, UN building, all that were built by the Chinese. I mean, that's the good news. That's the nice news. Okay. But the Chinese not only bring the bricks and the mortar, they bring the workers. And then
so there's no local content.
There's some local content. It's not zero. But when you get a Chinese project, you get a lot of Chinese with it, and then some of them tend to stay. And of course, if you're in a country that has 120 men to every 100 women, you're out looking for women, folks. You know, I mean, that's part of the story. And in Timor, there were people that were complaining that, you know, these Chinese had come in to help build these projects, and then they had ended up, you know, starting Timorese families, and now they were running all these little businesses in the different villages and everything else, and that they weren't, you know, particularly sensitive. I was told in one building that the Chinese built, no one could figure out what was the hot water and the cold water because it was all in Chinese, and they didn't know. The hotel I was staying at had this big welcome mat in Chinese, so it was, you know, it was like, you know, hey guys, at least, you know, try to get something that's in English or in Portuguese or in something. So, you know, there's a little bit of pushback, I think, or concern. People love Chinese investment. They love Chinese money. They don't necessarily love getting a couple thousand Chinese workers with it. They don't, you know, particularly like some of the after effects of that. And this could have been part of, you know, Burma pushing back a little bit. When I talk to the Chinese, they say, yeah, you know, it's been a little setback, but they'll come around. You know, next year things will get started back up, or they'll find something else for us to do. At the end of the day, they need money. We've got money. We're their neighbor. We cast a big shadow. You're gonna come around. Now, as far as, you know, access to the Indian Ocean, what does that mean? I mean, you know, you don't take a ship and put it on your shoulder and carry it, you know,
right,
8,000 miles through China and then set it back down. You know, they're talking about pipelines. Pipelines are pretty vulnerable. You know, I mean, that's why people at the end of the day are always nervous when they build a pipeline, because it's a lot easier to interdict a pipeline than it is a sea lane. So, yeah, so the Chinese have got some influence. I'm certain, you know, these are some shortcuts. They're going to help build railroads, and just like the Russians and the Chinese want to build a railroad from the Russian Far East to South Korea through North Korea. It's not because they're trying to find jobs in North Korea or find influence in North Korea. They want to get to South Korean goods and get them up, you know,
well, the same is
in a
true
cheap way.
with a proposed gas line into South Korea from
Yeah.
Russia as well. You
Yeah.
have to cross North Korea.
Yeah.
The same concept.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that this let's call it a pushback on this. I mean, this dam project is no small potatoes. I mean, potentially, my understanding was it was going to flood an area roughly the size of Singapore, which is a pretty big holding pond there, if you will.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that the same concept that you've been talking about.
I'm not sure who was doing their environmental impact statement, David. It was obviously not the same group that was against the super ferry
here. Yeah, we don't want to talk about that there. But you know, it's interesting that in 2011, the same kind of pushback occurred in Vietnam, And it wasn't that there was a Chinese project that was stopped. It's just that when there was this flare-up in the South China Sea, there were all these protests in Ho Chi Minh and in Hanoi. And my understanding is the reason was that the local people were just fed up with the Chinese government or state-owned enterprises picking up all the infrastructure projects from the Vietnamese government, and then bringing in all their workers and all their supplies and materials and everything, and the Vietnamese companies got no benefit out of it. And so while they didn't stop the construction, there certainly was some ugly anti-Chinese protesting that took place in Vietnam as another type of pushback that we saw.
And you know, and that's new, but it's also 3,000 years old. You know,
that's right.
The history of the Chinese pushing and the Vietnamese pushing back is not necessarily a new phenomenon. In recent years, the Vietnamese were busy pushing other people like the French and us, but now they've gotten back to the natural order of things, which is pushing back the Chinese. So,
well, Ralph, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. You've been watching Asian Review. We've been talking about Myanmar and some other countries here. Good night.